Hi, my name is Darren Gabbert. I'm a photographer here at 345 Auction. And I would like to talk to you today about this particular camera and specifically about the process of due diligence that we here at 345 Auction go through in order to make sure that when you see something on our website up for auction, that it is in fact what we say it is. And specifically with very desirable objects like the Leica, there are a lot of fakes out there, a lot of counterfeits that look very similar to Leica. They actually even operate pretty much like a Leica, but they are not, in fact, the real type of Leica camera. And this particular camera, when it came into the shop, was one of those objects that provided an interesting case study in how to do due diligence. Now, one thing that I didn't know at the beginning, when this came in and I started to do research on the Leica camera, was that there were several fakes, or several companies that created fakes during the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s. Two notable Russian manufacturers made Leica fakes, and they even had the Leica branding. They looked almost exactly like Leica. They were functional cameras, in fact, but they were not Leicas. And so as I started to do the due diligence on this particular item here, there were some things that caught my eye that made me wonder if this wasn't in fact a Russian fake. And so when I began to do my research online, I found a lot of information that made me think that this was in fact a Leica camera. There were certain things like the lens, we had the rangefinder here, all of the let's say the general appearance looks to be accurate, but there were a few things that just kind of caught my eye. One was this. Whoops, there we go. On the lens itself, there's no serial number. German companies of this particular era put serial numbers on just about everything. There's a serial number up here on the top that says 37015, which would put this as a 1930s or a 1930 manufacturer, which would make it a Leica Model 1. However, here's the thing, it doesn't look like a Leica Model 1, it looks like a Leica Model 2D. And that caused me some concern until I realized, or until I found information that said that Leica would had a program early on in their history that allowed for people who had purchased, let's say, an older model Leica to send it back to the factory, and Leica would put all of the current bells and whistles onto the older model. And this would be one of those. This is the rangefinder here on top. The Model 1 range did come with a rangefinder, but it was an add-on here on the accessory shoe. And it was a tall, square tube that had the rangefinder up here. And you could use it just like you would any rangefinder to set the distance and the focus here on the lens. So I looked at that and I thought, well, maybe this is, in fact, a refit. It's a Leica Model 1 that has been refit. But there were a couple of other things that caused me some concern. And I made up a list of these concerns. And then what I did was I went to an online forum for people who love Leicas and who do a lot of research for Leicas. It's a wonderful resource, and I would highly recommend doing this to anybody, especially if you see something online in our auction or anybody else's auction, and it's a desirable object like this. Do your own research and find these online communities of people who are enthusiasts about a particular thing. And so I came up with a list of things that caused me concern. For instance, here on the top, the engraving seems a little bit, not quite the standard that I would expect for Leica. Also right here is the serial number, 37015, but it looks to be not engraved very well. So that caused me some concern. I thought perhaps somebody had gone through to, with a fake and had just, they didn't take the time. So there was this on the top. There was this little guy right here, this little sleeve that goes around the shutter release. I came to find out that that was probably an aftermarket thing because Leica did not provide for these. And then also the fact that this did not have a serial number, and right here on the side, these little lugs, those lugs are supposed to hold camera straps. And in all of the pictures that I saw of Leica models 1 and 2, I never did actually see lugs for the camera strap. So that caused me some concern. Now on the bottom here, there is a base plate that is obviously not the same as the rest of the camera. And what I came to understand is that this is a Leica base plate. However, it was probably added sometime later. Now, I had my list of concerns. The top here, the lugs on the side, and the fact that this didn't have a serial number, the lens didn't have a serial number. And I posted photos to this online forum, and I got some amazing responses back. Stuff that I had no idea, but I had very specific questions, and they had very specific answers. Now, the fact that, let's start with the engraving up here. I came to find that in the early days, Leica would paint the metal housing of these rangefinders before they actually did the engraving. And so you would bring your Model 1 in, and they would replace all of this. This particular metal housing then would be painted before the actual engraving. But what would happen at the time was when they would engrave this, the engraving wasn't necessarily that deep, and the paint itself would be a little fragile right around where the engraving was. In later models, Leica would go ahead and carve deeply and then put white paint on the inside, or I think maybe it was enamel, I forget exactly, which looks a lot more like what you would expect from Leica. But this, I came to find out, was very standard practice, especially for the refits. They would etch this in, they would carve this in, and the paint would sort of rub off over time. And so it doesn't look like, well, let's say you would expect the Leica quality to be, but in fact that is fairly standard practice. The other thing that I had, the question was here on the serial number. The serial number just does not seem to be, well, for all intents and purposes, very well done. But what I've been led to believe, or I've come to understand, let's say that, is that the original Model 1 serial number would have been on the top of the top plate here, but because Leica put the rangefinder housing on top now, they just transferred the old number to the top. So again, it was sort of a second-hand thing. It was a process that Leica was still in the process of creating, finding the best practices. And because this was an early version, it didn't have the same kind of quality that you might expect, but it was, in fact, a reasonable thing to see. So that made me feel a lot better. This particular piece right here is just kind of generally acclaimed to be an aftermarket piece. And when it came to the lack of serial number on the lens, here's what I found out. When you would send in the original Model 1 to be refit with a rangefinder like this, usually what would happen is Leica would take the original lens, which in the Model 1s did not have serial numbers, and they would simply reformulate the camera itself and then the lens and put the original lens back on. So the fact that this does not have a serial number would lead me to believe, and I was told by the folks at the Leica forum that it's not uncommon to see that. In later models, after this became fairly standard, the removable lens and replaceable lens became fairly standard, they would, in fact, make sure that each and every lens had a serial number so that you could trace the serial number of the manufacturer for the lens, you could trace the serial number for the manufacturer of the camera itself. You can put, in fact, different lenses on this particular camera because it has been retrofit. Now let me show you another little interesting piece here. This lens originally did not come off the camera, but during the refit it did. Now, there are a few items, a few elements of this particular ring here that make me think that it is in fact a Leica. There's a little zero here at the top that was put on to these rings by Leica that indicated that this camera was now able to accept multiple different lenses. And they had this screw mount, as you saw me unscrew. Now, on the inside here, just at the top underneath where that 0 was, there is a round pad on the apparatus that runs the rangefinder. And that is very specifically a Leica characteristic. The Russian knockoffs did not have the round pad. They had different shaped pads, squares, triangles, whatever. So that is a good indication that this is also a natural Leica. Now, I found a fellow on the Leica forum that was able to tell me that this particular camera lug right here is in fact probably real. He has several Model 1s and Model 2s that have this particular lug here, and several models that don't. Apparently, it wasn't necessarily standard for Leica to put the camera strap lugs on both sides, but they did in fact happen. So this might be a fairly rare instance of a Leica Model 1 that has the camera lugs in it. Also, I found out, you'll notice that right here you can see through to the bottom. This coating is called vulcanite, and it gets fairly brittle over the years, and so it's not uncommon to see this chipping right here. But what I found out is that Leica never painted the bodies. They painted the top plate, they painted the bottom plate, but they never painted the body itself. So if you see a Leica that has, let's say, paint right here to cover up perhaps a place where the vulcanite doesn't really meet the body itself, that is actually an indication that it's a fake. But because this does not have the paint, that's also a pretty decent indication that this is. So having gone through this process, having done my own research online, found several questions that I needed to have answered, I went where the answers were. And I went to a Leica, online Leica forum, and those folks were very helpful in being able to tell me that, yes, this is, in fact, probably a Leica Model 1 built in 1930, that it was sent to the factory for a refit, and that everything that you see here is pretty much as it should be. It looks as it should. And so in that process of due diligence, what we look for are things that make sense, right? And especially, there we go, especially as it is concerned with a company that has very well-known practices in manufacture, that this is the way it should look, and these are the things that you should look for. And so this particular camera here meets all of the, I had questions, but those questions were answered satisfactorily to me. And so I can say with certainty that this is that Leica Model 1 built in 1930. It's over 90 years old, and quite frankly, I hope that I look as good as this camera does when I turn 90. Actually, it's 90, I guess it would be almost 93 now as we move into 2023. So anyway, if you have any questions or comments about this particular video, or you have a question about the camera itself, and this includes anything that we have on the website for auction. If you have any questions, contact us through 345auction.com, and we'll hopefully be able to answer that, whatever question that you might have about the item that we're selling. Thank you for watching, and hope that 2023 is a good year for you, and I hope that your bids go well.